What?
He's been in Toastmasters for 3 years, and you go, well, yeah, there's been a lot of people in Toastmasters. But he saw the light, and he joined TGIF 2 years ago. Now, he has seen a little bit different light than maybe some of you have seen. Because if you count that, then that's 2 clubs he belongs to. But no. You'd say, well, a club a year, you know, maybe he belongs to 3 clubs. No, you'd be wrong.
ADD kid.
You'd say, well, all right, he just joined a 4th. No, you'd be wrong about that too. We understand that he is addicted to Toastmasters. And our hearts go out to him because he's already joined 5 clubs. And just to show you that volume is more important than quality. His after-dinner speech this evening is, no kidding, 18 to 20 minutes. There'll be a restroom break in a minute.
There'll be an intermission. What if I have to replace the film?
Fellow Toastmasters, the speech title is Feel the Lesson. Please help me welcome Mark Stiving. You're welcome.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and welcome guests. In the year 2000, our president, Akshaya Mahapatra, was applying for a job as an engineer. He passed all the technical hurdles. He was on his last interview with the hiring manager. There he was, sitting across the table, and the hiring manager looked at Akshaya and said, I will hire you in one condition, that you join Toastmasters. And Akshaya luckily joined TGIF. Now, Blanca's story is not hugely different. Blanca was having her annual performance review, and her boss at the time said, next year in your goals, you need to join Toastmasters. Warren Riley said he joined because he wanted to become better at his business and personal communications. And Hana Shibuya said, and I quote, I was desperate to be better at public speaking. Now, all of these people joined Toastmasters because they wanted to improve their public speaking. Do you remember why you joined Toastmasters? I would propose that's not really why we joined Toastmasters. The ability to stand up here on a stage and not die of stage fright while you're giving a speech isn't enough. What we really care about is the ability to stand up here on a stage and talk to an audience and impart a message, to have an impact on their lives. Frank Mangini told me he joined Toastmasters because he wanted to be a better teacher. Frank wants to have an impact. Erica Wong said she joined Toastmasters in the short term to become better at presenting. But in the long term, she wants to motivate and inspire young girls in Asia to achieve faster. Erica wants to have an impact. I would bet every single one of us in this room really want to have an impact. That's why we joined Toastmasters. So how do we do this? We do it by helping our audiences feel the lesson. Feel the lesson. What does that mean? Feeling is really a pseudonym for memory. Let's start with memory for a second. Do me a favor. We're going to split the room in half right here. This half of the room. This half of the room. What I'd like you to do is think of a memory. Some memory that happened a year or more. Doesn't matter what the memory is. Just think of the memory. This half of the room, hopefully you're Toastmasters, think of a speech that you've heard a little while ago. Not something really recent, and not something that you've done your own, but a speech that you remember from a month, 2 months, a year, 10 years ago. Now what I'd like you to do is think in your head real quickly, how can you tell somebody what you're thinking in 5 whole seconds? Because I'm going to give you 10 seconds to share with your neighbor, and your neighbor to share with you what that message is. Are you ready? Go. Tell your neighbor what your memory is, please.
My best memory was Lauren giving that speech with a clicker and nothing on the screen.
Yeah.
That's 5 seconds.
Talk about pictures.
My memory is sense to me.
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful.
That's long-term
That's
memory.
wonderful.
Just get a refreshing.
Short-term memory.
Now let's start with this side of the room.
I remember.
Would anybody over here be willing, in 5 seconds or less, to tell us what was your memory?
Nobody?
Please.
I remembered the time when my wife and I were moving a long way and spending every weekend in our new house getting it ready to move into. It was a magical time.
Thank you very much. Somebody else.
I
Richard.
remember last year my daughter was married, my stepdaughter, and she had 3 men in her lives. Her father, her twin brother, and gratefully me. And she didn't know what to do about having us walk the bride down the aisle. So her brother started, I picked up the middle, handed her off to the father, and he took her to the altar.
Thank you very much.
We all got it.
So did you forget the 5-second rule?
Walk that far.
Please, absolutely please. Last one.
I remember when this club did not have women.
Good time.
I remember the big controversy that went on about allowing women to join this club. And I have to say my husband was in favor of it. And I look around and I see all these women today and I think it's wonderful.
Now we want to learn a lesson from this side of the room for a second. You all thought of emotion, thought of memories. And every single memory that we heard, and I could probably guarantee you that every single memory that was thought was tied
If you
to
put
an
it in front of
emotion.
me, I'm going to eat it.
The reason we remember is because it was emotion. Let's go to this side of the room for a second. They were not very good at keeping to the 5-second rule, guys. Can anyone on this side of the room share with us a speech they remember? Who gave it? What was the topic? And please, I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, Gil. Oh.
I gave a speech a couple of times, and Maren will remember it, and so will a number of people, and it was about my daughter's giving a gift to a young child in Oakland.
That was
And
good.
it was really, really wonderful.
Thank you. Mr. Bezchek.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, I gave a speech about Saving Private Ryan. And what I did is I got these packets of tomatoes used, and I had a World War II bayonet. And I had a number Stiving type of weapon with a firearm. And I stood up there and in front of an evaluation contest. Unbelievable. Ellen Bryson was sitting about this far away. I said,
Thank you,
chop
Bill.
one off now. Whoosh! And it was all covered with it. You go about it.
You know better too.
Yeah.
You know better.
Is my time up yet? Yeah. Okay, so when we think about the speeches that we remember, there's 2 things we want to think about. The first thing is, these were emotional speeches. So just like the memories were emotional, these speeches we remember were emotional. But the other thing that's really important to learn is that every one of these emotional speeches was a story. It was a story because what happens when we tell stories is we put our audience in the story itself, and they're able to feel the emotion of that story. And that's why they're able to remember our speeches. In 1979, there was a commercial, you may recall it. Mean Joe Green is hobbling down a tunnel after a football game. And a little boy walks up to him, scared. Says, "Hey, Mr. Green, you're the best ever." Mr. Green just kind of looks at him. And the little boy is holding a drink in his hand and offers it to Mr. Green. What was that drink, by the way? Coke. Excellent.
Dr. Pepper.
Hands this Coke to Mr. Green. And Mr. Green just chugs the whole thing. And the little boy turns around and walks away dejected. And Mean Joe Green says, "Hey, kid." And then what's he do? Throws him his jersey. Okay, do you guys know that this commercial was 32 years ago and you remember it today? Do you know why you remember that?
Because we're old.
Because it was an intensely emotional commercial. You could put yourself in the shoes of this little boy and you could feel what he felt when he was scared, when he was dejected, when he was elated. We remember that commercial. Last year, Carol and I, my wife, we got to go to the International Toastmasters Convention. And that's where they hold the competition for the world champion of public speaking. This year, there were 81 contestants that had earned the right to compete for world champion of public speaking. So on Thursday, they held 9 contests with 9 speakers each. Because of the way they sailed, Carol and I were able to watch 3 of those contests. We saw 27 speakers that day. And then on Saturday, the winners got to go present in the big auditorium. When I say big auditorium, 2,000 people in this huge auditorium. And I remember David Henderson's speech. David Henderson walks out on the stage. He's got this leather pilot's hat on with goggles. He's got a leather airplane jacket on and a white silk scarf around his neck. And he starts out, he's playing Snoopy, fighting the Red Baron. He tells the story that as an 8-year-old kid at a Halloween party, he meets this girl who shows up in the exact same outfit, but she didn't have a scarf. Sometime during the party, he gave her the scarf, and they became best friends and played for a long time after that. Several years later, the girl got sick with sickle cell anemia, and she was in and out of the hospital frequently. But David didn't like visiting her in the hospital. He didn't want to go. But his mom pressured him, saying it's good for you, and she really, really needs this. And as we're nearing the end of this girl's life, David walks into the hospital room. He's wearing his hat once again. And he says to her, "Do you remember how we met?" And she said, "Of course." She reaches over into a drawer and pulls out that white scarf and says, "Whenever the pain becomes too much, your love gets me through." When David finished this speech, I looked over at Carol. Carol looked over at me, and she said, "Are you crying?" I had something in my eye. Honestly, this was the most emotional 7-minute speech I have ever seen in my life. But the lesson that we want to learn from this is the fact that I watched 36 great speeches in those 2 days. And I walked away and remembered one speech. Now, does the story we tell have to be this big, epic story? Absolutely not. I used to be part of Warren's Saturday workshop until he kicked me out. There was one weekend that the exercise was you're to tell a story from something that happened the week before. It's just an exercise to see, could we come up with stories? And I remember this one story that Hannah told. Hannah, for some reason, had to drive her husband's car. And it was the week before their anniversary. And as she's driving along, she could hear this ting, ting. What was that? Ting, ting. Could it be my anniversary gift? Ooh, should I check? Should I look? And she built this up, and I was curious. I was really curious what was going on. And she looks, eventually, looks under the seat, and it's a screwdriver and a can of WD-40. But the important part here is that she told this absolutely nothing little story that had me so engaged, had got my emotions up, that I can remember it and repeat it a year later. So we don't have to tell these epic stories. All we have to do is bring emotion into our stories, and we can get people to remember. So let's review where we are so far. You thought you joined Toastmasters because you wanted to become a better public speaker. But in truth, you joined because you want to have an impact. To have an impact, we need people to remember our speeches. To get them to remember our speeches, they have to be emotional. And if they're going to be emotional, they need to be stories. So to have an impact, we want our audience to feel the lesson. And feeling is that story that causes the emotion. But what about the lesson? We want them to feel the lesson. How many of you saw the Karate Kid movie 20 years ago? The old one with Mr. Miyagi and Daniel San. So Daniel San was getting beat up in school all the time, and he wanted to learn karate. So he goes to Mr. Miyagi, and Mr. Miyagi reluctantly teaches him karate. And he hands him a rag, a couple rags, and says, "Go wax my car. Do wax on, wax off." And Daniel San went to do wax on and wax off. And every once in a while, Daniel would just be doing this to wax the car. And Mr. Miyagi said, no. Wax on, wax off. And Daniel San did this day after day after day. And one day he just got tired of it, and he was ready to quit. Mr. Miyagi walks over to Daniel San, and he starts to punch, and he says, "Wax on." And Daniel San blocks the punch. And he throws the punch with the other hand. He says, "Wax off." And Daniel San blocks the punch. He taught the lesson at the end. He got Daniel to remember this wax on, wax off, but he never taught the lesson until the very end. We tell a lot of stories in Toastmasters. And the stories are kind of like wax on, wax off, where it's interesting and it's fun, but it didn't teach the lesson. Hannah Shibuya, I'm sorry for picking on Hannah tonight, but a few weeks ago she gave a speech that was phenomenal. She has parents that are in Japan. And with the earthquake and tsunami that came through, you can imagine she was terrified about what was going on with her parents. Through email, she was able to reach many different friends and relatives, but nobody could find her parents. She was nervous. We were all feeling that same angst that she was feeling. And eventually, she got a letter in the mail that told her her parents were okay. That was an amazing story. And everybody that saw it thought it was fascinating. Very emotional. But if I could make one suggestion, that suggestion would be to turn this powerful emotional story into a lesson, into something with impact. So if I had given the speech, I might have ended it with something like this. When I received that letter, I was relieved. And that day I vowed that I was going to create a contingency plan with 3 different processes to get a hold of my parents. So next time there was an emergency on that side of the island or this side of the island, I knew I was going to be able to reach them. What about you? Do you have loved ones across the country or around the world? Do you have a contingency plan to reach your parents? All that did was take the powerful story she told us and put a lesson to it. It didn't have to be that lesson, it could be any lesson. Frank Mangini told me about a story or a speech that John Love gave before I joined TGIF. Many of you know that John used to stutter. I've never heard him stutter. But John gave a speech, and he described the process and how hard it was for him to come to TGIF. How he came every week and did his best, and over time, he got better. And at the end of that speech, he taught the lesson. He said, just show up. If you show up every week, you'll get better and better. Frank Mangini learned from that speech, and he just shows up every week. I don't mean that in a bad way. The thing I love about this story is that John Love gave a speech, and it impacted Frank's life. I love that. John told an emotional story about overcoming stuttering, and he wrapped it up with this moral of the story, which is just show up. And he was able to touch a life. I keep coming back to Erica's goal. Erica wants to be able to inspire and motivate young Asian girls to achieve earlier in life. Erica will succeed at that. She will tell stories. She will take those stories and wrap them up with a moral. She will make her audiences feel the lessons. What about you? In your next speech, are you going to tell a story? Are you going to wrap it up with the emotion so we can all get the lesson? I challenge you. No, I challenge all of us to make our audiences feel the lesson. I challenge us to give speeches that have impact. I challenge us to touch people's lives. After all, that's why we joined Toastmasters. Mr. Toastmaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take a minute and give Mark the benefit of your thoughts on that little slip.